Sunday mornings were usually the calmest moments of the week for Mark and his family. The soft glow of stained glass windows filtered through the old church sanctuary, the faint hum of the choir's hymns wrapped around the pews like a comforting blanket. Mark's son, Tommy, sat quietly beside his mother, clutching the small church bulletin, his eyes wide with curiosity. But today, something was off. From the corner of the sanctuary, Karen's sharp voice cut through the murmurs and whispers of the congregation. Karen, the notorious HOA neighbor with a reputation for drama, was already frowning as she strode down the aisle. Her icy glare locked onto Tommy before Mark even noticed. Tommy, just 8 years old, was a lively kid with an infectious smile. Earlier in the service, he had accidentally bumped into Karen while reaching for a hymn book. A small, innocent mistake. But to Karen, it was the spark that lit a powder keg. Without warning, Karen's hand shot out and struck Tommy sharply on the arm. The sound of the slap echoed through the sanctuary, silencing the choir mid-verse. Tommy's eyes welled with tears, his small face crumpling in shock. "Why did you hit my son?" Mark's voice was steady but cold, every muscle tense as he rose from the pew. The congregation turned, a ripple of gasps spreading like wildfire. Karen stood her ground, her lips curling into a sneer. "Your kid was bothering me," she snapped. "Maybe if you kept him in line, this wouldn't have happened." Mark's heart pounded, adrenaline surging. Years of police training kicked in instantly. This wasn't just some neighborhood spat. Karen had crossed a line no one should ever cross, especially not in a place of worship. "Enough," Mark said, stepping closer. His eyes locked on Karen's, unflinching. "You don't hit children. Not here. Not anywhere." Karen's eyes flickered with something dark, a dangerous glint Mark hadn't seen before. She looked ready to lash out again. The priest, sensing the escalating tension, hurried down the aisle, placing a hand gently on Karen's shoulder. "Let's calm down, please," he urged softly, though his eyes betrayed his unease. Mark crouched beside Tommy, brushing tears from his son's cheek. "You're okay, buddy. Daddy's here." Karen scoffed and turned away, but not before muttering loud enough for others to hear. "You think you're some kind of hero? Off-duty cop or not, I don't care." Mark's jaw clenched. Karen had, just challenged him in front of the entire church, and she didn't know who she was dealing with. As the service resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. Eyes darted between Mark and Karen, whispers starting up quietly. The usual peace was shattered, replaced by a simmering tension that promised this wasn't the last anyone had heard of the incident. Mark kept one arm protectively around Tommy, his mind racing. He knew the world outside the church doors wasn't always fair. But here was supposed to be safe. But Karen had just made a big mistake, and Mark was ready to make sure she paid for it. The church service ended with heavy silence, the congregation filing out quietly, avoiding eye contact with both Mark and Karen. The warm sunlight that usually bathed the parking lot in a peaceful glow felt strangely cold as Mark gathered his family and moved toward their car. Tommy still clung to his father's hand, wiping at his cheek where Karen's slap had landed. His small voice trembled as he asked, "Daddy, why did she hit me?" Mark swallowed the lump in his throat. "Sometimes people make bad choices, buddy, but I promise I'm going to make sure you're safe." Karen stood nearby, arms crossed, watching with a smug expression. It was clear she expected more confrontation, but Mark was calm. Off-duty or not, his training never truly switched off. As the family loaded into their SUV, Mark's mind was racing. This wasn't a simple neighborhood dispute. Karen's reaction was explosive, and her attitude afterward, like she was daring Mark to push back, was a red flag. He glanced at his wife, Sarah, who met his worried gaze with a nod. They both knew what this meant. Trouble was coming. Later, that evening, after putting Tommy to bed, Mark sat at the kitchen table, reviewing his mental notes from the incident. As a police officer, he'd faced danger many times, but this was different. This was personal. "Did you see the look on her face?" Sarah asked quietly. "Like she's planning something." Mark nodded slowly. "She's not just angry. She's calculating. We need to be ready." He pulled out his phone and started typing a message to his precinct's community liaison officer, requesting advice and discreetly mentioning the church incident. Even though he was off duty, he had to be cautious. Karen was clearly volatile. The next day, Mark decided to visit the church early, hoping to find calm and maybe speak with some of the regular attendees who had witnessed the event. Inside the empty sanctuary, the stillness was a stark contrast to the tension from yesterday. The priest greeted Mark with a tight smile. "I'm sorry about what happened," the priest said. "Karen's behavior was uncharacteristic, but we're not sure what triggered it." Mark's instincts told him there was more beneath the surface. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen again. It's not safe for any child here." The priest nodded solemnly. "We're planning to hold a meeting with the congregation next week. It might be best if you're there." Mark agreed, but sensed that a formal meeting might only stir the pot further. He needed proof, something concrete. Later that afternoon, Mark stopped by his home, installing a discreet security camera covering the front porch and the street. It wasn't just paranoia, it was preparation. Karen's hit had been brazen. What might she do next? Meanwhile, word was already spreading through the HOA and church community. Mark overheard murmurs while at the grocery store. Some people sympathized with Karen, others were quietly supportive of Mark. But a few whispers hinted at a darker side, claims that Mark was overreacting or even provoking Karen. That night, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows outside his window seemed longer, more threatening. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Stay out of Karen's business if you know what's good for you." His blood ran cold. Mark locked the doors and checked the security camera feed. Nothing yet. But the warning was clear. Karen wasn't just angry, she was dangerous. As he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Mark knew this was far from over. He was off duty, yes, but when it came to protecting his family, there was no off switch. Karen had made a big mistake, and Mark was ready to expose the truth, no matter what it took. The next morning, Mark arrived early at the neighborhood coffee shop, hoping to catch familiar faces who might have witnessed the incident at church. The usual crowd was there, but today, conversation stopped as he entered, eyes shifting uncomfortably. "Mark," said Linda, a kindly elderly neighbor who'd lived in the community for decades. "I heard what happened at church. Terrible." Her voice lowered. "But you might want to be careful. Not everyone's on your side." Mark frowned, taking a sip of his coffee. "What do you mean?" Linda glanced around, then leaned in. "Karen's got a way of twisting stories. You might find some neighbors believe her version instead of yours." Mark's gut tightened. He already knew rumors could be more dangerous than outright threats. As he left, Mark noticed a group of HOA members clustered near the community bulletin board. Their eyes flicked his way, and he caught snatches of conversation. Heard Mark was the aggressor. Heard it was just a misunderstanding. The tension in the neighborhood was thicker than the morning fog. Back home, Mark sat, down with Sarah, frustration mounting. This isn't just about what happened at church. Karen's setting a narrative, and some neighbors are buying it. Sarah nodded. "We need to find people who saw the truth." Mark pulled out his notebook, scribbling down names of potential witnesses. Mrs. Collins, who had sat near Karen that day, the church choir director, even the parking lot attendant who'd heard raised voices. But even as Mark plotted his next move, a shadow lurked. A dark sedan was seen parked just a few houses, down from their street. It wasn't the first time Mark had noticed the car, but today it felt deliberate. Mark's police instincts kicked in. surveillance, stakeouts. He wasn't off duty when it came to protecting his family. That evening, while reviewing the security, camera footage, Mark noticed something unsettling. A figure, hooded and unidentifiable, pacing near their driveway just after sunset. The camera caught a glimpse of a hand slipping something under their front door. Mark rushed outside, heart pounding. There, on the welcome mat, was an envelope, unmarked, no return address. He hesitated before opening it, a sense of dread settling. And inside was a single typed note. "Back off, or next time it won't be just words." Mark's hands clenched into fists. Karen's threat was no longer veiled. The following days were a whirlwind of whispered warnings and uneasy glances. At the local grocery store, Mark heard snatches of conversations designed to unsettle him. He's making a big deal out of nothing. Probably wants attention. The neighborhood was turning against him, and Karen was at the center of it, but Mark refused to back down. He arranged quiet meetings with witnesses, gathering their statements, some hesitant but truthful. He began compiling a record, piece by piece. Yet, the biggest shock came when Mark found an anonymous message in his mailbox. "You think you're the only one watching? We know your every move." Fear clawed at Mark's throat. The safety of his family, his son Tommy, was under siege in ways he hadn't imagined. That night, as Mark lay awake, every creak and shadow outside felt magnified. He wasn't just fighting one angry neighbor anymore. He was battling whispers, shadows, and unseen enemies. And Karen's hit in church was only the beginning. Mark's world had shifted. What began as a simple act of aggression in church had escalated into a web of threats and secrets that threatened to consume him and his family. Determined not to be caught off guard again, Mark spent the next morning setting up additional security measures around his home. Cameras discreetly positioned at the front porch, side yard, and even near the mailbox ensured he could capture any suspicious activity. But Mark knew that cameras alone wouldn't stop Karen's plans. He needed witnesses, voices to back up the truth. The church choir director, Mrs. Bennett, was Mark's first call. A kind woman with a no-nonsense attitude, she had witnessed the incident firsthand. Over coffee at the small cafe near the church, Mrs. Bennett recalled the moment Karen lost control. She was tense, like she was holding something in, Mrs. Bennett said, stirring her tea. Then when Tommy bumped into her, it was like a switch flipped. Mark listened carefully, sensing there was more beneath the surface. "Did you notice anything unusual about Karen lately?" he asked. Mrs. Bennett hesitated. "She's been arguing with some neighbors about the HOA rules. And I heard she's been showing up at the meetings with a new group, people no one knows well." Mark's mind raced. Was Karen building allies? Or was there something else fueling her anger? Next, Mark spoke with Mr. Daniels, the parking lot attendant who often overheard conversations during Sunday services. "I heard Karen shouting on the phone just before the service," Mr. Daniels said. "Something about making them pay. It didn't sound good." That phrase echoed in Mark's mind. Back at home, Mark reviewed footage from his new cameras. One clip showed a shadowy figure lurking near their gate late at night. Zooming in, Mark caught a glimpse of the person's face and froze. It was someone from the HOA board. His heart pounded. Could someone he trusted be working with Karen? Mark decided to confront the HOA president, Mr. Crane, under the guise of routine. Neighborhood concerns. Mr. Crane's stiff smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mark, these are serious accusations," Crane said cautiously. "You must be careful not to stir trouble," Mark pressed on. "There's a stranger around the neighborhood, and I found this person near my home." "Care to explain?" Crane's expression tightened. "I have no idea who you're talking about." Mark knew better. There were alliances he hadn't uncovered yet. Later that evening, Mark found another envelope slipped under his door. This one contained photos, grainy images of Mark leaving and entering his home, time-stamped late at night. A chill ran down Mark's spine. Someone was watching him, tracking his every move. But then, an unexpected sound came from the security monitor, a faint whisper. Mark replayed the audio. It was a low voice, barely audible. "You're getting too close." Karen's warning was no longer just a threat. It was a promise. Mark's resolve hardened. He couldn't let fear win. He called Sarah into the study, showing her the footage and notes. "We need to prepare for anything," Mark said grimly. "Karen isn't just angry. She's dangerous, and whoever's helping her is playing for keeps." Sarah nodded, worry shadowing her face. "What about Tommy?" Mark looked at his son sleeping peacefully upstairs, innocence untouched by the storm. "We protect him, no matter what." As darkness settled over the neighborhood, Mark sat at his desk, surrounded by evidence and unanswered questions. The line between friend and foe was blurring, and Mark was racing against time to uncover the truth before it was too late. Karen had ignited a fire in the community. Now, Mark had to find out who was pouring fuel onto it. The quiet tension that had settled over the neighborhood shattered the moment Mark received the official letter. It was from the HOA board, a formal complaint filed by Karen herself, accusing Mark of harassment and intimidation. The accusation was as shocking as it was brazen. Mark sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. Karen was weaponizing the very system meant to keep their community peaceful. Sarah looked over his shoulder, her eyes sharp with concern. "She's trying to turn this against you." Mark nodded slowly, a heavy weight pressing down on him. "And if the HOA believes her?" The complaint alleged that Mark had been intimidating neighbors, causing disturbances, and disrupting community harmony. It was a strategic move, designed to isolate him and paint him as the aggressor. Mark's mind immediately shifted into police mode. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about protecting his family and the truth. He contacted his precinct's legal advisor, explaining the situation. The advisor warned him to tread carefully. The HOA had its own rules and politics, and Karen was clearly playing hardball. Meanwhile, word of the complaint spread quickly. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip and speculation. At the local grocery store, neighbors avoided eye contact or whispered behind closed doors. Even some friends began questioning Mark's version of events. Mark felt the sting of isolation, but refused to show it. The HOA board scheduled a hearing for the following week, a public showdown that would force Mark and Karen to face off. In front of the entire community, Mark spent every spare moment preparing. He gathered witness statements from the churchgoers and neighbors who had seen Karen's aggression firsthand. He compiled photos, security footage, and even that chilling audio recording. But Karen wasn't sitting idle. Rumors circulated that she had secured support from influential HOA members and was ready to make Mark the villain. On the day of the hearing, the community center was packed. The air was thick with anticipation and hostility. Karen entered with a confident smirk, flanked by supporters who nodded approvingly. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every eye on him. He glanced at Sarah and Tommy, sitting quietly in the back. The HOA president called the meeting to order. Karen launched into her accusations, her voice sharp and rehearsed. She painted a picture of Mark as a bully, disrupting the peace and threatening neighbors. When it was Mark's turn, he spoke calmly, deliberately laying out the facts. He described the incident at church, Karen's attack on Tommy, and the ongoing threats they'd faced. He presented his evidence, photos, witness statements, and recordings. The room was silent, tension crackling in the air. Then, a murmur rippled through the crowd as a new witness stepped forward. Mrs. Collins, a quiet neighbor who had stayed silent until now. "I saw everything at church," she said firmly. Karen hit that boy first. Mark only stepped in to protect him. Her testimony shifted the atmosphere. More neighbors nodded, breaking the silence. But just as Mark felt hope, a sharp gasp cut through the room. Someone had revealed a new piece of evidence, an anonymous letter accusing Mark of violating HOA rules in unrelated matters. The room erupted in whispers. Mark's heart sank. Karen smiled, sensing victory. Mark's mind raced. The fight was far from over. But one thing was clear. This battle wasn't just about the past. It was about every moment yet to come. And Mark was ready to face whatever Karen threw next. The community center's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the HOA hearing entered its most intense phase. Mark's pulse hammered in his ears, but his voice stayed steady as he addressed the mounting accusations. Karen's supporters whispered behind her back, casting suspicious glances, while Mark's small group of witnesses clung to their seats, silent but resolute. Just as the HOA president prepared to move toward a vote, a young woman stood up from the back of the room. Her presence was unexpected, and her expression was serious. I have something to add, she said, holding out a folder thick with papers. The room fell into a tense hush. She introduced herself as Jessica, a neighbor who had remained quiet, until now because she feared backlash. But the evidence she brought was impossible to ignore. Texts, emails, and photos documenting Karen's calculated attempts to manipulate the HOA board and spread false rumors about Mark. One message stood out, a text from Karen to a local board member urging them to make Mark pay and threatening to reveal his dark past. Mark's heart skipped a beat. A dark past? What could Karen possibly know? Jessica continued. Karen has been orchestrating this campaign against Mark for months. She's not the victim, she's the aggressor. Suddenly, the hearing transformed, from a debate over minor complaints into a full-blown investigation. Karen's face flushed crimson, her confident facade cracking. She lashed out, accusing Jessica of lying and threatening legal action. But the board wasn't so quick to dismiss Jessica's evidence. The president called for a recess to review the documents. Outside, the tension was palpable. Karen's supporters clustered, whispering heatedly. Mark stood with Sarah and Tommy, feeling a cautious hope growing. During the recess, Mark pulled Sarah aside. That text, dark past, I need to know what she's talking about. Sarah frowned. What could she mean? Mark shook his head. I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. The hearing resumed, and the board announced their preliminary findings. Karen's complaint would be dismissed due to lack of credible evidence, and an investigation into her conduct would begin immediately. The room erupted in mixed reactions. Cheers from Mark's supporters, shock and anger from Karen's camp, but the climax was yet to come. As the meeting drew to a close, a voice from the back spoke again. This time, it was a man Mark recognized, a neighbor who rarely spoke, known for being quiet but observant. I've been watching this all along, he said, eyes fixed on Mark. I think it's time you know the truth about Karen and about you. The room fell silent. Mark's breath caught. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope, handing it to the HOA president. Open this carefully, he said. The president hesitated but complied. Inside were police, records and reports, all pertaining to Mark. Allegations from years ago, mostly minor, but enough to cast doubt on his character. Gasps echoed through the room. Karen's smile returned, wider and more sinister than before. Mark's world tilted. What had been a fight to protect his family was now a battle for his very reputation, and this new revelation threatened to undo everything. As he looked at the faces around him, friends, foes, neighbors, Mark realized the stakes had never been higher. The question was no longer just who was right or wrong. It was, How far would Karen go to destroy him? The room was thick with tension. Mark's eyes scanned the police records spread out on the table. Years-old incidents, mostly minor infractions, but enough to taint his image in the eyes of many. Some neighbors whispered, others stared with judgment. Karen's victorious smirk burned into Mark's mind, but Mark refused to be broken. He cleared his throat. "Those records don't tell the full story," he said firmly, "and none of it has anything to do with the incident at church, or the threats my family has endured." The HOA president nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "We need to verify all sides before making any final decisions." Mark took a deep breath and decided it was time to reveal his own discovery, something that could turn the tide. "I have proof," Mark announced, pulling out his phone and connecting it to the projector. The screen flickered to life, showing a series of video clips and messages. First, footage from the church cameras showed Karen's aggressive behavior, the slap, the angry glare, even moments where she appeared to be instigating neighbors behind. The scenes. Then, messages from Karen's phone to various HOA members, including threats and demands to discredit Mark. The room murmured in shock. Karen's face twisted with rage. "That's fabricated. You're lying." Mark held up his hands. "All of this is time-stamped, unaltered. You can verify it." The HOA board exchanged looks, the balance shifting. But just as Mark felt hope, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or your family will regret it." A cold shiver ran down Mark's spine. The room seemed to close in around him, but he stood firm. Sarah squeezed his hand gently, whispering, "We're with you." The HOA president called for a pause in the hearing, urging calm. Outside, Mark's mind raced. The threats were escalating. Karen's network was larger and more dangerous than he'd thought. Determined to protect his family, Mark decided to investigate Karen's past. He discovered she had a history of conflicts in previous neighborhoods, often involving harassment and manipulation, but no one had ever confronted her head-on, until now. Late that night, Mark received a knock on his door. Heart pounding, he opened it to find Jessica, the neighbor who had stood up at the hearing. "I think Karen's planning something," Jessica said urgently. "She's dangerous. I found out she's been trying to get into your home while you're away." Mark's jaw tightened. "We need to get ahead of this." Together, they reviewed the security footage again. This time, they spotted another figure, someone disguised, trying to force open a window. The threat was real. And immediate, Mark called the precinct, requesting backup and advice on restraining orders. The next days were a blur of police meetings, community gatherings, and preparing for what felt like a war. But through it all, Mark never lost sight of the goal: protect his family, expose Karen, and reclaim peace. Just when he thought the worst was behind him, the final twist hit. A voicemail left on Mark's phone. Breathless, urgent, and unmistakably Karen's voice. "You don't know everything. Mark, you have no idea what I'm capable of." Mark stared at the phone, the weight of her words settling like a dark cloud. The battle was far from over, and the biggest fight was yet to come. The voicemail lingered in Mark's mind like a dark warning. Karen's chilling words echoed through the silent house as he stared at his phone, heart pounding. She was far more dangerous than he'd imagined, and the stakes had never been higher. Mark knew the truth about Karen's past, and her web of lies was just the beginning. She had one last move, and he had to be ready. The following Sunday, Mark and his family returned to the church. The atmosphere was tense. Whispers and sideways glances followed them as they took their seats. But Mark noticed something else, a presence that made his skin crawl. Karen wasn't alone. She arrived flanked by two unfamiliar men, stoic, imposing, and clearly there to intimidate. Mark's instincts screamed danger. When the service ended, Mark's opportunity came. As Karen moved toward him, the crowd parting like a dark sea, Mark stepped forward. "Karen," he said, voice steady but low. "This ends today." Karen smiled, cold and calculating. "You don't get to decide when it ends, Mark. You've poked the bear for the last time." Suddenly, one of the men stepped forward, blocking Mark's path. But before anything could escalate, a firm voice cut through the tension. "Back off." Mark turned to see several neighbors, those who had supported him all along, stepping forward. They weren't alone. More church members, fed up with Karen's reign of fear, formed a protective circle around Mark and his family. The men hesitated, glancing at each other. The power balance was shifting. At that moment, the police arrived, tipped off by Mark earlier. Officers swiftly approached, questioning Karen and her companions. Caught off guard, Karen's confident facade crumbled. The police revealed she was under investigation, not only for harassment, but also for trespassing and threatening behavior. The crowd watched as Karen was led away in handcuffs, her fury replaced by stunned silence. Mark exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. But then the unexpected happened. One of the officers pulled Mark aside and handed him a file. "It's about those records you showed earlier," the officer said. "We dug deeper. There's more to your past than we thought." Mark opened the file to find an old case, one he'd never mentioned from years ago, involving a cover-up that threatened to ruin his career. His heart sank. How had Karen gotten hold of this? Before he could react, the officer added, "We're reopening the investigation, but we want to hear your side first." Mark realized the battle wasn't just against Karen anymore. His own past was coming back to haunt him, but this time, he wasn't alone. At church, the community gathered around, Mark and his family ready to support him. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but with truth and courage, he could face whatever came next. As he looked at Sarah and Tommy, Mark felt a renewed strength. Karen had tried to break him, but in the end, it was Mark's resilience and the power of a community united that won the day. And as the sun set on their quiet neighborhood, one thing was certain. This story was far from over.